Good morning. Please be seated. So if you didn't know, today is a great day. I'm sure for many of us, we'd like to believe that every day is a great day, even when it's not. But today is truly a great day. Today we mark the end of a year, and tonight we celebrate something new, the beginning of the new year. This idea of a new beginning is really important in our human lives. We need the hope that we can start new, that we can actually forget the old, press forward to something better, or even on occasion, we just want to start all over again. You see, we all need the hope of a new beginning, a new day, and a better tomorrow. Today's gospel reading was really written for us to have that hope. In fact, if ever the entire gospel could be found in a single set of verses, it would be found in these profoundly moving verses 1 through 18 of our gospel according to John. When my own life's challenges are overwhelming and the distractions of the day are just too much, I find that just taking a few moments out of my life to reflect on these verses puts perspective back in my own heart and puts love in my soul. John begins telling the story of the good news of Jesus and using some of the greatest words of all time. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him, not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life. Did you catch that? We received life, and that life was the light of all the people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. There is hope. I have titled today's sermon, The Hope of My Heart, to really think about and ponder together, what does that hope mean? Because a lot of times words like these that we've just heard, we've probably heard them, maybe 100 times in our life. It happens to be one of those more popular scriptures, one that's really foundational to our theology of how we receive Jesus as our Savior, of who he was from the beginning. But to John's Jewish listeners, it is oftentimes the case that they were hearing something entirely different than we are. You see, when they heard him say, in the beginning, they heard the beginning. The phrases that we capture from Genesis on, in the beginning, God created the world. And that was a story that was familiar to those Jewish listeners. They knew that ground. They were on a safe place, they thought. But then all of a sudden, John adds a little extra language, something they were not expecting. That not only was God, the Word, Logos, there at the beginning, but Logos, the Word, was God. This was a strong claim that he was making. John the disciple was making this claim that the Word was God. Now, we might think that's no big deal. Again, easy to get comfortable with words that we listen to all the time. But for the time and the days of the first listeners to this gospel, it was a radical message. And even though he uses simple vocabulary, his message is far from simple. You see, he was claiming that Jesus, a man that he knew and followed himself, was a fully formed man, and yet was also the very essence of God. The idea of the Word as being a flesh and blood person would have been a startling idea to both the Hebrews and the Greeks at that time. But maybe that was his intent, to startle us a little, to shake us up a bit, to remind us that hope and grace of the life and death of Jesus cannot be taken for granted. We must not become complacent with these words, because we and everyone around us need this hope. Who was John anyway to make such a claim? Was he not just a simple fisherman? Was he the son of Zebedee and the brother of James? Actually, of course, as you can imagine, there's been a lot of scriptural debate about that over the years. The scholars debate who wrote this and who wrote that. But actually, of the gospel according to John, the earliest traditions teach us that it was truly John the disciple, John the apostle, John the revelator, John. So let's look at who was John. What did his life experience tell him about hope? This is a question. One thing he did throughout the Gospel of John is he never referred to himself as I, John. Anyone know what he said? He said, I, that beloved disciple of Jesus. I was the beloved of Jesus. And he mentions that 5 or 6 times. He calls himself the disciple whom Jesus loved. And why did he say that? He didn't want to insert himself, but he wanted to claim that he was an eyewitness to miracle after miracle, story after story. He lived those stories, and that was part of his message of hope. You see, John and his brother James were actually some of the very first followers of Jesus. They were one of the first 4 who were called to be his disciples. But tradition actually says that John was following John the Baptist before that, together with Andrew, the brother of Simon Peter. And it was one of those things where apparently it's also tradition that he was the youngest of all the disciples and the apostles. You could just see him young and passionate and learning about all these things and believing all of his life and history that the Messiah is coming, when all of a sudden he meets John the Baptist, who's telling him the same thing. The Messiah is coming. The Messiah is coming. And I am not worthy to tie his sandals, right? So the moment that John the Baptist said, and there he is, John the evangelist followed him. He moved immediately into that path. And in fact, he was absolutely passionate about following Jesus. He left everything to follow him in that moment, and then he went and got his brothers. And then they got more people, and then they got more people, and pretty soon it was a whole flood of folks following Jesus. But John, being one of the youngest disciples, was also known to get in a lot of trouble throughout the stories of the gospel. So much so that Jesus actually called he and his brother the sons of thunder. And there's story after story where they kind of blew it here and there. But at the same time, Jesus invited John and James and Peter to be a part of that inner circle to witness story after story about Christ's amazing power. They were the only apostles that were there when Jesus raised the daughter of the soldier, Jairus. They were the only apostles there when the transfiguration occurred. You might remember they fell asleep a lot. They also fell asleep a lot when they were up with Jesus higher up on the mountain. It was Peter, James, and John, this John that's telling us about the word, when he was praying and sweating blood in the Garden of Gethsemane, and they fell asleep again. After the arrest of Jesus, Peter and the other disciple, according to John, followed him into the palace of the high priest. And tradition tells us that too was John. He was a big follower. John it was who stood at the foot of the cross when Jesus was being crucified and spoke to him and said, John, your mother. And to his mother and said, here is John, your son. Along with Peter, he was the first to run to the empty tomb after hearing from Mary that it was empty. He also recognized Jesus on the shore when he and all the guys went back to fishing and while they were waiting. And then after the ascent of Jesus, after the resurrection, John, together with Peter, were the founding members of the church. And there's story after story, both in the scriptures, in the book of Acts, as well as many extra-traditional, extra-scriptural sources. So it is the same guy. Do you think he has any credibility? I'm thinking he might. He might have something to say to me that I should listen to about this. One of the things they say is that he not only told the story of the gospel that he wrote, these are his words. Of course, with controversy, they also say he wrote the 3 books, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and of course, Revelation. But what you may not know is a little bit of the history around all of that. As I mentioned, he was called John the Elder, John of Patmos, John the Evangelist, the beloved disciple. And most of the early writers testify that he outlived the rest of the apostles. Tertullian was a 2nd century theologian who reported that actually the apostle John was captured by the Romans, brought to the Colosseum, and was thrown into a cauldron of boiling oil in the Colosseum as a form of execution in front of thousands. Yet he was unscathed and unharmed. It actually is known that everybody in the Colosseum believed in Jesus after that miracle. And because he didn't die in the cauldron, they exiled him to Patmos and commuted his sentence. You know the rest of the story. As he was the only apostle who did not die as a martyr, just imagine the life that he lived and the deaths that he saw. All of his fellow apostles, starting with his brother just 11 years after the crucifixion, was the first martyr, James, in the year 44 AD. He knew what hope meant. He believed in these words. He lived these words. He lived with hope. So going back to the scriptures today, and he says, "And the Word became flesh and lived among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. From his fullness we have all received grace upon grace." This is the message. God has broken into our daily lives. Every day he is present. John says to us right here, he says, "I have seen him. I bear witness," just like John the Baptist, that this man who lived among us is God. There is hope. We can know God. And the world needs this hope and light. Darkness is ever around us. And this is really my point today, is that our job is to know that hope and to carry that hope outward, because every day around us, people are hopeless. So I'm going to tell a story. It's a little bit of a hard story. It's a little bit of a true story. It's a very true story. And it's moving, and it might jar you a little bit, but that's the point. This month in Calistoga, a young woman left a suicide note in her home, and she went up the Hill Mine Trail to take her life. Her father found the note and called 911. As the first responders raced up the trail to find her, everyone hoped she would be alive. They wanted to help restore her perspective that she was deeply cherished and wanted and loved, that there is hope. The parking area filled up with family and friends, with everyone waiting to hold her and fill her, but it was too late. She was found in a fetal position, and her life was gone. The parking lot filled with crying and wailing, and all hope was lost. This is true, and Christopher was there. So sometimes I think we live in a hopeless world. How can there be no hope that someone takes their life? How can they live without knowing that God is real and God is here, and there is hope in Jesus? Maybe you know others who need hope, or maybe you need a little hope yourself. Like, who couldn't use a little hope now and then? Jesus has overcome the world, he says, and gives us real hope, that we are loved and cherished, and that we are here for purpose. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God, born of God. This is what John is telling us. This single statement of truth should shatter every single cell in our being with love. That's how we need to hear those words. You see, I myself need this hope. Many of you know that I am on the precipice of new beginnings myself. And in fact, I'm living through more than one transition. Many of you have been praying for my family and I as I continue to seek God's direction for my professional life. And as you've heard, I am also following the call of Jesus on my life to a particular ministry by becoming an ordained deacon amongst you. I want to talk about what does that mean, because it's tied to hope. The deacon is called to a particular ministry to serve all people, but particularly the poor, the weak, the sick, and the lonely. My role is to study the scriptures, to seek nourishment from them, and to model my life upon them in your midst. I am to make Christ's redemptive love known to you and to those in the world by my words, by my example, and really by all that I do and say and live, to those I live with, my family, those I work with, and those I worship with, all of you. The deacon's role is to interpret to the church, the needs, concerns, and hopes of the world. But really, it's my job here to tell you that the world needs hope. Just like this precious young lady in Calistoga. She needed hope. Where were we? We didn't know. But there's probably people really close. Maybe our next door neighbors, maybe someone in our own homes or families. They need hope. They need this message from us. And what do you know? God is calling you to be a messenger of that hope today. In verses 6 through 9 of our gospel reading today, John the Baptist gave witness to the true light that he was coming into the world. And John the evangelist describes that even when Jesus was in the world, and even the fact that the world came into being through him, the world did not know him. Jesus came so we would believe, but the world did not believe. He came to his own people, but his own people did not accept him. But for those of us who do accept him, for we who do believe, he gives us power to become the children of God, being born from God himself. He gives us the power to receive profound love. You hear that? We have power to receive the love he's given. Grace upon grace, lavished by his heart beating for us. Perhaps my favorite words in this passage, 1 through 18, is really in the last verse, in 18, where John describes Jesus as God, the only Son, who is close to the Father's heart. Here, John explains that we can lean into his arms, just like John did at the Last Supper, because he was the disciple whom Jesus loved, just like you are. And as Jesus himself leans into the arms of the Father, as John tells us, he is close to the Father's heart, we too can lean into the arms of Jesus. Just imagine that. Leaning in, being held, hearing his heartbeat pounding out love for you, translating to you the Father's passionate longing for you as his child, and finding grace upon grace and light in the midst of darkness. As the Gospel of John's concluding verse states, may you believe that Jesus the Christ, the Son of God, and that in believing you will have life in his name. I'll read that again. May you believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that in believing you will have life in his name. This is my hope for you. May we all find hope in these words and bring these words of hope to the world. Amen.